So once again, we're honored to have back here with us Dr. Adam Francisco. And again, you look at his bio, and like the other presenters, it's very impressive. But he's a great communicator and has done a lot of study that is very helpful on a very practical level in the area of apologetics and elsewhere too. So he was here last year to present, and you've also presented, I think you presented at our Reformation lectures, did you? And you presented for us down in San Antonio, Texas, and maybe other times too. But anyway, he's a good friend of ours and very knowledgeable, and so he's going to be talking to us on the legacy of the early church apologists and beyond. So let's welcome Dr. Francisco.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? I think I hear me. Okay. I hear lots of voices. They're usually just in my head, but I can hear. I don't have a PowerPoint, kind of like Mr. Parton mentioned last night. Technology and I just are in a love-hate relationship. And PowerPoint in particular is a train wreck for me. I once did a lecture. I was invited to do this thing in Long Beach, California, to present a case for Christianity for a mostly Muslim audience, hosted by a church, which was interesting. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. And I had heard the president of Concordia University, Irvine, who was the president, or my president at the time, because I was on the faculty there. So I thought, oh, I better put a PowerPoint together just to make it look real fancy. And did my thing, got to the end of the talk or the lecture and noticed that I hadn't advanced a single slide on the PowerPoint. So the former Secretary of Defense in the first Trump administration, a guy named, he was a Marine Corps general, Mattis, once said that PowerPoint is going to kill us all, so I'm in good company. I also don't like PowerPoint or outlines for that matter because it constrains, because you have to think about it ahead of time. And then maybe the day of, after you've heard other people talk, you want to rearrange things. I'm going to try to stick to the main point of this outline. But on that note, I do want to, if you would, flip to the very back. It just mentions some things very, very quickly with regard to the bibliography or references. I didn't want to burden you with a ton of stuff. Quite literally, the people we're going to talk about, these early church, and I'm going to take a very expansive definition of early church apologists that includes some medieval thinkers and even includes a early modern thinker, a guy named Hugo Grotius, to be in that. But most of their work is available through just a simple Google search. So I didn't want to be redundant and put all that, but there are a few sources in the back, because I mentioned a few obscure apologists, or I will, that if you're so inclined, you could pick these up. The history of Christian apologetics is a fascinating, nobody's interested in it, but it's a fascinating field. There are not a whole lot of works that cover the whole gamut of Christian apologetics from, say, Paul at Mars Hill to today, to Bethany Lutheran College and the Center for Apologetics and Worldviews. But there are a few have been written. You always have to be careful with some of them. So, for example, one of the standards is a Catholic man named Avery Dulles. He was a cardinal. Wrote a history of apologetics that is good for orientating you to the time periods and the people and so on, but his interpretation of some of the figures he deals with, in particular Martin Luther, really stinks. So you have to be able to hold your nose or kind of deal with that sort of thing. But anyway, so I'm following two tough acts and two presentations on probably I think I put in here or point to, but two stellar apologists from the 20th and early 21st century in the case of Professor Montgomery. They weren't just two among a bunch of other people. They were the eminent apologists of the 20th and into the 21st century. But even they stood on the shoulders of giants. There is a very, very long history of Christian apologetics that extends way back to the first century, to the time of the apostles, and we're going to spend just a little bit of time of illustrating some of the early activities of the apologists. And I should maybe note as an aside, I don't know if Craig is here, what I'm not suggesting when I say that Montgomery was standing on the shoulders of giants is that he was standing on the shoulder of Thomas Aquinas. He would have hated somebody saying that, but I'm using that kind of as a metaphor. But I'm going to trace the legacy of these early apologists for two reasons. One, just because it's a fascinating field. I want to illustrate that apologetics has been around for a long time, but I especially want to set it up over and against a certain attitude that's sort of settled in among some, or in some Christian circles, kind of set up as a foil, if you will. There is this claim out there among, for example, James K. Smith, who I mentioned here in this outline, and not a colleague of his, but a contemporary of his who, he's jumped around a bit. He's at a seminary, Philip Keniston, that suggests that the sort of apologetics that C.S. Lewis did, or the sort that Dr. or Professor Montgomery did, are sort of modern inventions, that they borrowed from ideals and standards that you only see pop up in the Enlightenment. And in particular, in James K. Smith's book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, in the first chapter, he makes the point, actually makes several points pertinent to Christian apologetics. The one that I really take issue with is he says that Christians today, because we live in this postmodern, post-Christian, and all these other post things that people use to describe our age, Christians today, because nobody in a postmodern world cares about truth, we're now absolved of the apologetic task. We no longer have to demonstrate the truthfulness of the gospel. To which, I met Jamie once, and I didn't have enough guts. He's a very, very smart man, polymath, probably. I didn't have the guts to ask him, and it was a big crowd anyway. But I wanted to ask, what do you do with 1 Peter 3:15? The exhortation that all Christians always be prepared to give a reason for the hope within them, and to do it with gentleness and respect. But what Smith argues in Who's Afraid of Postmodernism is, if you look at the details, he's not actually saying that we shouldn't give a public witness to Christianity. He's saying that the type of apologetics that are apropos for today are what Mr. Parton called last night presuppositional apologetics, and that the task of arguing to the truthfulness of the gospel from evidence and facts, from the resurrection of Jesus, the fulfilled prophecies in the person of Jesus from the Old Testament, that for Smith, that's not remnants of a bygone era. That was never really the standard sort of approach to Christian apologetics, which is interesting. Jamie Smith is a philosopher and a theologian. Apparently, he's no historian, because the bulk of Christian apologetics from the earliest days to the present has always been evidential. It's always, in addition to a negative approach that Mr. Parton talked about last night, critiquing or poking holes in your, for lack of a better term right now, opponent's position. There's always been this positive side to apologetics. And by positive, I'm not talking like self-help, pop psychology, positivity, or anything like that, but like making a case for the truthfulness of Christianity. That's been part and parcel of it from the very get-go. Philip Keniston, you can get this essay with just a Google search. It's available PDF online. He wrote an essay about the time that Smith's book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, came out, entitled, There's No Such Thing as Objective Truth, and It's a Good Thing Too. And he's a Christian, seminary professor. That title, he admits in the first paragraph or two was more like clickbaity. He wanted to get his readers' attention, but he makes a similar point to Jamie Smith that the days of people like C.S. Lewis and the activity of C.S. Lewis and Professor Montgomery are over. It's now the day where, and they've got a little bit of a point here, that it's especially, though, important for Christians in terms of their activity in the public arena to be authentically Christian. That is, rather than aping the trends of the world in terms of worship or something like that, just be authentically Christian. So they've got a point there. Smith even says that the best apology, meaning defense of Christianity, is the church. Now, I have friends, I'm not going to name names because we're live streaming and probably recording. I have friends in my circle, my ecclesiastical circle, who love that assertion that the best apology for Christianity is the church. They love it to get away from doing apologetics and emphasize sort of a like liturgical renewal and emphasis on those things. I've got no issue with liturgy and things of that nature, but overemphasizing that to the exclusion of a robust defense and explanation of the truthfulness of Christianity goes too far, if you ask me. And it also raises the question, like, okay, so what's church? You know, I mean, I know, I'll pick on my own group, the Missouri Synod. I know some Missouri Synod churches that, man, I would not want them to necessarily be like the spokesperson for the LCMS. Maybe in your circles, wherever you're from, you might have some of those. Certainly not the ELS, but I'm sure other circles. So anyway, the thrust of my thesis here, and this is not a super academic presentation, so I'm not going to footnote and things like that. But if there is an argument I'm making, it's this: that the positive, evidential, fact-based case for Christianity is the apologetic tradition of Christianity. The sort of presuppositionalism or this new kind of ecclesiastical type of apologetic that's around today is actually the one that's a novelty. And then when we come back after lunch, we're going to ask the question, like, what role do Lutherans play, or does the Lutheran tradition play in this big story of Christian apologetics from the early days? But you'll have to wait. You won't have to pay extra for it, but you'll have to wait till after lunch for that. So already made the point that C.S. Lewis and Montgomery were like the stellar examples of the great apologetic tradition in the 21st century. That tradition, and 20th, that tradition extends all the way back to the apostolic era. The New Testament is historical. It describes what happens in the first century, how, and so on. It is not, especially with the book of Acts, like this historical textbook that gives us every single detail of the early church. When Luke writes that, he's got a scroll he's writing on that only has a certain amount of space, so he's highlighting things. Interestingly, though, if you read especially the second half of the book of Acts, where Luke describes Paul's travels, you find several instances of the activity of an apologist. Paul himself in Philippians 1, verse 16, describes himself who has been set apart by God for the apologia to the defense of the gospel. I won't try to do the Greek because I'll mess it up. And there's too many people who know Greek here, so I can't get away with a sloppy rendition of it. I might quote some Arabic, though, because I'm counting that nobody knows some Arabic. or knows So Paul saw himself as one who had been called, set apart for the task of the defense of the gospel, and he certainly was the preeminent apologist among the apostles. A couple places that I would focus on or highlight that illustrate the earliest apologetic activity of Christianity is, of course, Paul at Mars Hill. I think we may have talked about that at last year's conference, but real quickly, Paul this is Acts 17, the second half of the chapter. Paul's already been to Thessalonica and he's been kicked out because he goes to the synagogues, as was his custom, Luke describes, and begins reasoning, I think that's the NASB translation, or debating with the Jews in the synagogue that it was necessary for the Messiah or the Christ to suffer and die, and that Jesus fulfilled those messianic prophecies. He gets kicked out, he goes through Berea and winds up in Athens. And Luke tells us he's in the marketplace, the agora, mixing it up with people there, looking at doing what missionaries today would call ethnographic research, kind of like what Dr. Heck was talking about a little earlier, like taking stock of like the context he's in. And Luke says he began preaching Jesus and the resurrection there in the marketplace, and nobody had ever heard of it before. And so to make it's not a long story in Acts 17, but to make a medium-sized story even shorter, Luke recounts how Stoic and Epicurean philosophers took him. It's not that they necessarily grabbed him, but they brought him up to the Areopagus or Mars Hill and asked him to tell them about Jesus and the resurrection. And Paul gives us famous, "Men of Athens, I see that you are very religious. You even have an altar to an unknown God" speech there. What's curious about that is, in terms of apologetic methodology, that sermon's very distinct. It's more like a natural or it starts with what we might call natural theology. The created order, seasons, and things like that. And it's not till the very end, in Acts 17, verse 31, that Paul proclaims that that God is done. His patience has basically worn thin. There will be a time where he's going to judge everyone, and he's given, as the NASB puts it, proof of this by raising his son from the dead. What's curious in that context, though, when Paul is talking, at least the way Luke recounts it, Paul nowhere in there quotes the Old Testament like he did in Thessalonica and everywhere else. But what he does quote are two little clauses or fragments from pagan poets. One called a hymn to Zeus. And uses that as sort of, he's not saying, hey, this guy got a whole bunch right. He's just using it as a way to capture the imagination or the minds of his audience. Anyway, as you know, as Paul travels around, eventually he gets arrested and he appeals to Caesar, and he goes through these small local trials before he gets to Rome and is ultimately executed under Emperor Nero. One of the trials that Luke records is in chapter 25 through 26 that culminates in Paul standing before King Herod Agrippa. This is chapter 26 in particular. That speech is remarkable. I wish, if I still lived in California and didn't live in that awful place called Illinois, I shouldn't have said that for the recording, but California is better than Illinois. But same political spirit, they're just nicer because they're hippies in California. In Illinois, they're mean because they're Marxists. But if I still lived there, I tried once. I drove through San Dimas. I didn't see it, but I'd probably go to San Dimas and try and find Bill and Ted and find their time machine. I would love to go back to the court there in the northern parts of Israel and hear the whole speech. Because as you know, when Paul preaches, he preaches for a long time. People fall asleep, even fall out of windows and things. We just get little snippets, but what we get is golden in Acts 26. Luke tells us that at a certain point, after the charges are read of what Paul's guilty of, Luke then says, then Paul was given an opportunity to give an apologia, an apologetic. And the bulk of the way Paul presents himself is mostly his testimony about how it is he went from a persecutor of Christianity to being a confessing Christian who's evangelizing at least the eastern half of the Mediterranean rim. But then he gets into, it's just a few verses, but he then gets into the gospel message and how it was that Christianity is not just some sort of feeling or private cult of belief or anything like that, but rather as a reflection of what Paul calls true and rational. sort of in 26 and the verses that are in the 20s, Paul's waxing eloquent, and he's stopped by Festus, who says, Paul, your great learning has made you manic or driven you crazy. Do you think in so short a time that you could convince King Herod to become a Christian? And Paul responds by saying, the king knows that what I speak is true and rational. Moreover, in Acts 26, verse 26, he goes, and the things I speak of, namely the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, did not happen in a corner. This could not have escaped his notice. So he then says, and maybe he's like Mr. Parton was talking about, he didn't lay down his uber monergistic cards. He says, not only do I wish I could persuade King Agrippa, but everybody here of the truthfulness of the gospel. That's Francisco's paraphrase there. It's not so the earliest church, we don't have, I wish we had more, after the apostolic era. We have a collection of writings, about a half a dozen, the apostolic fathers, through the rest of the first and into the very early second century. It'd be Eusebius, the church historian from the early fourth century, tells us a little bit of that activity. Some of it's kind of odd, like a letter from Jesus to the king of Armenia and things you're like, what? Things that aren't extant anymore, so you wonder if they actually are true. The letter from Jesus to the king of Armenia is probably a story he cooked up or a rumor that he reported. That's Eusebius, not the Bible, by the way. But right away in the second century, in thinking about church history, you see that the genre of Christian apologetics, like whole books or letters dedicated to defending the truthfulness of the gospel, begin to emerge quite prominently. And they address all of them. If you read, and they're available in English translation, most of them online, or you can buy them or steal them, whatever you choose. Probably shouldn't steal them, but from the library, that's a naughty thing. But if you read them, what's really curious about them is they all seek to address particular challenges that Christians are facing in that particular context. The most notable of the earliest apologists after the apostolic era, after the first century, is a man named Justin Martyr. Anybody, show of hands, heard of him? Apart from pastors, any non-pastors who've heard of Justin Martyr? Okay. He is, I think, by far the most famous of the early apologists. We have he wrote a lot. We only have, it seems, 3 things that are still extant that he wrote. 1 or 2 of them are called the First and Second Apology for Christianity. And the third, which is a remarkable read, especially if you read it alongside your Bible. So when he refers to a Bible verse, you go to the Old Testament and do a little study on that. It's called A Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, which might be, scholars can be awesome, but they can also be the most detestable people on earth. Myself excluded from all that, but one of the things with Justin Martyr is if you were to go read contemporary scholarly accounts on Justin Martyr, you'd find there's all sorts of debates about, like, is the First and Second Apology, are those 2 separate works, or is the Second Apology actually an appendix to the first one? Did the dialogue with Trypho the Jew actually happen or not, and so on and so forth? There are these sorts of issues. The standard story is, and there's lots of good evidence for it, is that the First and Second Apology were in fact written and addressed and actually sent to and most likely read by the Roman Emperor Antonius Pius. Perhaps also the subsequent emperor, the famous Marcus Aurelius, and the Roman Senate. The First and Second Apology are basically, they're prompted by at least 2 things. First and foremost, some pretty severe persecutions that are starting to break out. Christianity had been persecuted for some time, mostly locally, When you get into the 2nd century of Rome, though, it's not universal yet, but it's becoming fairly widespread. And what are called the 5 good emperors. Marcus Aurelius is the last of these 5 good emperors who start their lineage in the late 1st century. It becomes fairly programmatic for Romans to seek out Christians and to round them up and give them the alternative to either renounce their Christianity, offer a pinch of incense to show that you're actually dedicated to the emperor, or be executed. So that's starting to happen a little more normally in Justin Martyr's time. And additionally, there's lots of weird stories about Christianity that's starting to circulate in the empire as well. Accusations that Christians were atheists, that Christians were sexually immoral because husbands sometimes called their wives sisters in Christ. So you can imagine what they're thinking. And also, the third is cannibals. Because when they've heard, you might know that in the early church, after the typical practice from the source material that we have was after the liturgy of the word, if you will. After that's over, those who had not been baptized were dismissed, not harshly, but because then the sacrament of the altar, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist was going to be practiced, and if you weren't baptized and catechized, you weren't permitted to that. They guarded the rail very closely in the early church, hence why confessing Christians still do that to this day. So non-Christians they don't know what's going on, but they're hearing stories that when Christians gather in this sort of secret meeting, they're either having a love feast, like an orgy type of thing, or they're actually engaging in some sort of cannibalism, because they've heard that Christians believe that they're eating the body and blood of this person, Jesus. So Justin Martyr takes the opportunity he's a fairly, not a recent convert at this point, but Justin Martyr, we don't know exactly when he was born. We do know he was born, though, in Flavius Neapolis. It's found in the West Bank today in a city called Nablus. And he grew up, was kind of reared in paganism, but was always philosophically inclined. He tells us at the beginning of this work, Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, or he tells Trypho about a story that he was always after the truth. He started by hanging out with people who were students, or the lineage or the tradition of Aristotle. Then he poked around with Stoicism, and eventually he finds himself in Platonism, the philosophy of Plato. And while he thought that Plato was pretty awesome, never quite got all the way there to being completely persuasive as having a handle on the truth. And eventually, though, he as he's hanging out on the beach, or walking along the beach, he meets a guy who's a Christian who explains Christianity to him, and he becomes Christian. Probably he was born in 100 AD or thereabouts. This is probably about the 130s as far as we can tell. Justin Martyr eventually is going to travel. He's going to spend, basically he's in the sort of the northeastern parts of the Mediterranean rim teaching philosophy and so on. But around 150 or so, he takes the opportunity, because he's sick and tired of hearing these false accusations about Christianity, and he's also very concerned about his fellow Christians because they're being rounded up and inquisited and so on. So he takes the opportunity to write a letter, the audacious opportunity to write a letter to the emperor and the Roman Senate, and explains to him that appealing to Roman concepts of justice, that it's completely unjust, in fact, against the law, according to the traditions of Roman law, to round people up willy-nilly and without due process execute them. So it's not super lengthy, but there's several pages where he defends the legitimacy, the legal right of Christians to exist to the emperor and the senators. Then he gets into this wonderful section explaining what it is Christians actually believe, especially cleaning up the misconceptions about Christians being immoral and atheists and cannibals and all these other things. And that's the bulk of the first apology. But then there's this section that's much more apologetic, where Justin Martyr explains, and doesn't say it this way, but why the emperor and the senators should themselves consider the truthfulness of Christianity. And to make a long story short, he appeals to its antiquity, that Christianity, he makes the point, Christianity hasn't just been invented, but rather its wisdom precedes the wisdom of the philosophers like Socrates as we call him in California, Plato and Aristotle, that its wisdom is located back in the patriarchs and the prophets. And though they spoke of a Messiah who is going to be born in Bethlehem, who would suffer and die and rise 3 days later. And so from fulfilled prophecy and the historicity of the resurrection argues that this is true philosophy. All these others are basic pretenders that Plato gets you quite far, he thought. Lots of Christians, Augustine, even Luther on one occasion says that Plato's kind of a friend to Christianity. He's not all the way there, but it's like sort of the best of human reason. It's still filled with falsehood, but it'll get you so far. For Justin Martyr, Christianity is a true philosopher. So Justin Martyr always he even kept on wearing the dress of a philosopher. He believed that he didn't treat Christianity as just like one philosophy among many, but he was convinced of the absolute, not just the truthfulness, but the rationality of Christianity, that it fulfilled man's deepest philosophical and existential needs. Then he adds one more very curious thing that's very particular to Justin Martyr, though one could argue it's rooted in the Gospel of John. He argues that even your own philosophers and poets the reason why Plato and Socrates were able to assert and teach some aspects of the truth is because they had access to what he calls seeds of the Logos spermaticus. That God in nature had planted, much like what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, had put in the created order evidence, not just of his existence, but even his invisible attributes. So that every once in a while a philosopher gets something right for Justin Martyr is proof that they had access to this sort of logos, this natural law and natural theology embedded in nature. However, Justin Martyr was very clear that wasn't enough. One of the points that apologists have made for centuries is that there is the natural law and natural revelation of God in the created order. But like C.S. Lewis says in Mere Christianity, it doesn't get you any closer to actual Christianity. But it does establish sort of a framework by which the gospel can be understood more clearly. So that's the first and second apology. I'm flying through this stuff. The next work of Justin Martyr that's remarkable for its apologetic is this work called Dialogue with Trypho the Jew. It's probably not the minutes taken at a formal debate between Justin Martyr and Trypho, but it does read like it's from the recollection of Justin Martyr and this conversation or this friendly debate he had with this Jewish scholar named Trypho. Because at the end of the debate, Trypho's not converted. Usually, especially when you get into medieval dialogues between like a Saracen, that's the Muslim, or the medieval term for a Muslim, the Muslim always converts at the end, and it just seems kind of contrived. The dialogue with Trypho the Jew seems like an actually organic conversation that may have taken place. And that's a classic Christian apologetic vis-a-vis Judaism. It's 132 chapters long. Not to worry, though. Sometimes the titles of each chapter are longer than the chapter itself. So it's probably at most 100 pages long in a modern edition. It can be read in the course of an hour. But it is, if you have Jews in your life that you're interested in, you should be interested in bearing witness to the gospel among them, I highly recommend reading that. It will orientate you to an apologetic that is based squarely on the conviction that Jesus did in fact, and Christians believe this anyway, fulfill all those messianic prophecies from the virgin birth foretold in Isaiah 7 to the suffering Messiah in Isaiah 53 and all throughout the Old Testament. And Justin Martyr doesn't go through all of them, but goes through the most prominent ones. And in the end, demonstrates to Trypho as the dialogue ensues that Trypho, this Jewish guy, actually, while he knew the words, Justin Martyr makes this point, while he could read the words of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, he didn't understand them. A proper understanding of the Old Testament is one that says Christ is found throughout the Old Testament and that Jesus himself was an obvious fulfillment of those prophecies. So I have some Jews in my life. My sister-in-law is a very liberal Jew, and while one has to be very careful, because as you know, liberals oftentimes cry, I hope she's not watching this. We have a pretty good relationship, but we get, we every once in a while get to talk about these things. And it's interesting how Justin describes Trypho's grasp of the Old Testament is while my sister-in-law loves the fact that she's Jewish and can read through the Hebrew script, doesn't understand the text, what the text is actually saying. And when you illustrate, you go to Isaiah 7:14 or Isaiah 53 or Genesis 3:15 or any of the other hundreds of messianic prophecies, they're sort of surprised at how Christians actually do not see themselves as part of a religion that pops up in the first century, but rather of a continuation of the faith of Adam and Abraham, all the patriarchs and all the prophets who lived on the other side of the incarnation of God in Christ. We could talk at great length about Justin Martyr, but Justin Martyr eventually, though, he didn't write an autobiography. We do have an account of his martyrdom. Eusebius, the church historian, about 200 years later, gives us a bit of his life. We don't have a full account, but it seems that towards the end of his life, he had a fairly high-profile public debate with a pagan philosopher. And because Justin Martyr seemed very humble, but because that pagan philosopher's reputation was ruined from the force of Justin's arguments, it seemed that at least the way the story is told in those ancient sources, is that pagan philosopher eventually worked to get Justin Martyr arrested, and along with about a half a dozen of his friends, is found guilty of for high crimes against Rome, for being a bad citizen, basically guilty of treason, and guilty of all sorts of moral indiscretions. So he's eventually brought before the emperor and flogged within an inch of their life, and then summarily executed by beheading. But his work in the history of Christian apologetics begins this great genre of Christian apologetics that's directed at particular audiences. Still properly, the early church, probably the greatest example and most prolific example of an apologist in later centuries is none other than the great Saint Augustine. I'm sure you've heard the name. Born in North Africa in 354 AD, lives up until, I believe it's maybe I wrote it down, AD 430. Grew up Manichaean, part of this pagan philosophy that was very dualistic, that basically taught that in order to achieve some type of salvation, not in a Christian sense, one had to get past the earthly trappings and physical trappings. So kind of Gnostic in character. And Augustine had as he grew older, as a Manichaean, though, always had one problem. As he put it in his Confessions, he says he was always caught in this burning cauldron of lust. If you know anything about St. Augustine's life, he had a mistress and cohabitated with a woman for a while, was a very licentious individual before his conversion to Christianity. But once he converts to Christianity, satisfying fulfilling the prayers of his mother Monica, who was a Christian, he is basically forced to become a bishop and writes on any number of topics addressing or that the church was facing in the late 4th and early 5th century AD. I don't know that you can underestimate the influence of St. Augustine. He is revered in both Eastern and Western churches, so the Catholics and the Orthodox, and of course all Protestant denominations regard him, if they're aware of any sort of church history, revere him as a guy who in many ways, not in every aspect, exerts a tremendous amount of influence on Christianity today. Martin Luther was a monk in the Augustinian order. Augustine's work, The City of God, is probably the best example of Augustine's apologetics. It's a short work, about 900 pages in a contemporary edition. It's not short, that's a joke. 22 books in length. It took them over a decade to write, and it's filled with theology, stuff that's kind of devotional, exegetical, historical, but the overall thrust of that book was written to address particular pagan claims that are being made in the early 5th century. Early 5th century in the Roman Empire is now basically, in terms of the official religion of Rome, it's Christian. That had been done in the late 300s by an emperor named Theodosius. And what's interesting, though, is after Theodosius in the late 380s, 390s dies, the empire is pretty robust and strong up until that point, but when you get into the early 5th century, it's starting to experience some internal decay, certainly moral decay. There's still lots of pagans running around Rome. Many of the senators of the Roman government were held on to their paganism. But it's also experiencing, after not just decades, but actually about a century and a half, if not 2 centuries of, and this is not a contemporary political point, but illegal, what we might call illegal immigration into the empire. Barbarians coming from the north who are settling in Rome, whose loyalties are divided, and oftentimes if they're settled in a border town, another tribe's coming in, they have to decide, are they going to defend their borders, or are they just going to kind of step aside and let these other barbarians through? And so you have what are oftentimes called the barbarian invasions happening for quite some time. One of those groups in the early 5th century, Goths, they're described in some literature from the time as these wild men from the northern parts of Germany who didn't cut their hair, had long red beards, who were basically illiterate thugs, but were Christians. They weren't really Christians, they were Arian Christians. They'd been influenced, they'd kind of blended their tribal polytheism with a heretical form of Christianity. They, in 410, under the leadership of a guy named Alaric the Goth, they don't waltz, but they begin migrating not just into the empire and the northern borders along the Danube River or the Rhine River, but they begin making their way down into the Italian peninsula. And in 410 AD, sack the eternal city, the city that's never been conquered or defeated or experienced any sort of upheaval apart from natural disasters, for the first time in about 900 years. They run through the city, taking what they could get their hands on. Interestingly, though, they allow people, if they are able to make their way into the churches in the city of Rome, they don't mess with the churches, and they don't mess with the population taking sanctuary in the churches. They sack the city, and then they go back. They head back north. And from what we can tell from like a letter of Augustine and also the work, The City of God itself, is the charge then quickly is raised by pagans when people are wondering in Rome, how is it that the eternal city, that this once strong empire born out of a republic, is now so weak that a bunch of backwards, knuckle-dragging thugs from the north could easily just sort of waltz in and take what they wanted? And the answer from senators in Rome and pagan populations is because Rome under Theodosius had adopted Christianity formally as the state religion, and so Rome has turned its back on the gods. And since Rome has turned its back on the gods have turned their back on Rome. And I mean, that seems kind of weird, right? But in the 5th century, that was taken very seriously. Romans had for centuries, you find it in most of the writings of Roman historians, they credit the stability, the orderliness, the military prowess of Rome and the success of the military, not just on having genius military leaders like Julius Caesar or somebody like that, but on the piety of the Roman people and how dedicated they were to making sure that not just privately in their homes, but publicly, they maintained all the rites and rituals that Romans had practiced for their history. And because of their piety, the gods rewarded them with security. Well, now they've turned their back on the gods. The empire has turned its back. And so the gods have allowed pagan, or not pagan, but these barbarians from the north to waltz right in. Now, again, that sounds like a weird claim, but apparently from the little pieces of evidence we have, it was actually not just taken serious, but there were a number of old money type of families in Rome. These very traditional landed elites in Rome who had recently become Christian, who revert back to their paganism as a result of this claim. And St. Augustine is back from Rome, back living in North Africa at the time as bishop, and he's asked for like 3 years, you need to, and he only hears about the sack of Rome later on, but you need to write something addressing this because it's becoming a problem. There's a real danger that the Roman Empire might revert back to paganism. So in 413, he starts writing the City of God. Because of time, we're going to describe this 900-page work in about 2 minutes. The work is divided up into 2 massive sections. The first 10 books are basically what we might call the negative apologetic, where St. Augustine is critiquing the claims, the theology, if you will, of paganism, demonstrating on one hand that actually, while to be sure Rome was sacked, that Rome was not ruined is attributed to the foggy, to be sure, but the slight Christian morality of the Goths, because they had embraced a kind of Arianism or fused that into their paganism, and so they were starting to learn a bit of morality, or at least preference for fellow Christians. So they allowed people who took refuge in sanctuaries in churches. They remain unmolested in the sack of Rome. But then Augustine, spends a good bit of time over the course of several books in that first half in going through a whole bunch of pagan theological writings, and shows that and basically argues that you Romans talk about this religion of yours as if it's this sort of stable thing that reaches way back to Romulus and Remus. He goes, if you just look at all your literature, you'll see that this is not Augustine's term, but it's a honkin' mess. It's filled with contradiction. The gods are described as basically human beings writ large, and the most detestable of human beings writ large, who are constantly raping humans, engage in all sorts of unethical, immoral behavior. In short, there's no good reason to believe any of this stuff that you talk about is true, much less good or beautiful. Now, that's 10 books, 400 pages. There's a lot more to it than that. The second half of the City of God is basically Augustine's positive apologetic. Over 12 books, the last half, he begins to construct and argue for what we might describe as the Christian worldview. Based on the biblical text, but sprinkled throughout the books 11 through 22 are all sorts of kind of factual arguments that the resurrection of Jesus is something that happened in real time and space. Now, he doesn't get into like sophisticated, more modern type of arguments saying you can go and check out these particular sources, but he does make points that these things that we speak of, like Paul says, did not happen in a corner. They're a matter of real time and space, empirical history, if you will. And he spends a great deal of time going through, I don't know if it's every book of the Old Testament, but through the Old Testament, that Christianity is just simply a fulfillment of what the ancients were looking forward to for centuries. And in the end is, when you get to book 22 of the work, Augustine basically has described the Western Christian worldview that though it will be amended in pieces and parts through the Middle Ages, basically as the foundational text for the construction of medieval Christendom for about 1,000 years and even beyond. So we're out of time. We're almost out of 2 minutes. We're not going to be able to do Q&A this before lunch, but so that's Augustine addressing particular pagan claims. We're going to get into one more story, and then we're going to cut it off before lunch because I know you're hungry and you're not laughing at my jokes. Maybe I haven't told many jokes, but as we get out of the ancient world, the next major challenge that's going to be posed to the Christian faith in the Mediterranean world and a little bit beyond is the challenge that's going to emerge from Islam. Islam begins in the 7th century. By at least traditional Muslim accounts. To be sure, in the historical record, you see it in full bore, certainly by the early 9th century, so the early 800s. Actually, you see it a little before then. John of Damascus, for example, one of the great Greek Orthodox theologians, writes on it in the 8th century. But once you get into the 800s that you start to see this genre of apologetic literature being directed at Islam from Christian authors. And some of you might know some of the challenges that Islam poses to Christianity. Certainly politically or socially, it has tremendous challenges. When Muslims conquered, at least in the ancient world, I'd argue that it didn't die out in the ancient or the medieval world, that eventually as they, either by conquest or by influence, start taking over institutions, they eventually start running the whole operation, and the Quran gives very specific instructions on how Muslims are to treat Christians under Muslim rule. In particular, they're relegated to the status of dhimmis, or second-class citizens, who are not permitted to publicly display their Christianity. They can't wear crucifixes or ring bells in their churches. They certainly can't proselytize. And if they do, oftentimes would have their heads very quickly removed. Even so, despite all this, there was a bishop, a theologian who became a bishop named Theodore Abu Kura in the early 800s, who was able to, and he didn't write an autobiography, so reconstructing his history is a bit tenuous, but who in the early 800s gains enough clout with Muslim audiences that he's invited to engage in debates with Muslim theologians in places like Upper Mesopotamia, like the city of Haran is where he was located, but in the heartlands of what was called the Abbasid Caliphate. And this is the last point I'll make about that before we'll pick up on this after lunch. Theodore Abu Kura was so robust in his argumentation, his critique of Islam, and his positive case for Christianity, that after Theodore Abu Kura's death, and after the death of the Caliph that permitted him to participate in these debates, the subsequent caliphs have to issue all sorts of they called them Quranic laws that prohibited such debates. Because we know from even Muslim Arabic sources that Theodore Abu Kura upsetted Muslims so much that many of them were converting to Christianity. We'll have to pick up on his story after lunch so that you'll laugh after you've got a belly full of food.
All right, thank you very much. So go and enjoy a lunch, and we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock.
We last left off in the Middle East with a guy named Theodore Abu Kura. I think I mentioned his biography is a little hazy because we just don't have an autobiography or even a biography by somebody, but we do have lots of biographical comments or descriptions, piecemeal descriptions in both Christian and Muslim literature in Arabic. Theodore Abu Kura, I think the last thing I left with you is that he was, not all scholars agree, but most do acknowledge he participated in several high-profile debates at the court of the Caliph. The Caliph at the time was a man named Al-Ma'mun, who was in the history of caliphs, kind of the direct opposite of, if you remember, ISIS Caliph al-Baghdadi, direct opposite of that. This guy was kind of liberal-minded, So he hosted these debates, but apparently things went sour because Theodore Abukura did his homework and it upset the consciences of Muslims. And then the subsequent caliph, a man named Al-Mutawakkil, decided there will be no more debates between Christians and Muslims in the Muslim world. So what was the force of Theodore Abukura's argument at these debates? Again, hard to know because we don't have firsthand accounts of the debates, but what Theodore Abukura did do is leave behind a pretty large corpus of Christian writings in Arabic by an Orthodox Christian, both small o and big O, that address the specific claims of Islam. He's the first Orthodox Christian to address Islam in the Arabic language and to write Christian theology in Arabic. One of those works is called On the True Religion. There are others, and if you look at these works, you can kind of figure out what he probably argued before the Caliph, because there's these recurring things. Lots of similar things in apologetics up until that point. An argument from fulfilled prophecy in the Old Testament, and also an argument from the resurrection of Jesus as vindicating or verifying his deity. But those arguments in a Muslim context oftentimes meet particular objections. In particular, Muslims typically make two claims when they are encountering the claims of Christianity. One is that the Old and New Testament, more precisely the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospels, have been corrupted through the textual transmission. And contemporary Muslims love to use the work of people like Bart Ehrman, these text critics. They're actually more like higher critics masquerading as text critics around to back up their claims. But they claim that the source material from which Theodore Abukura based his claims was corrupt, so untrustworthy. So he has to fashion an argument for the reliability of the scriptures, that it's been in a Muslim context. And what he does is really quite remarkable, and other Christian apologists in his wake will make this a fairly standard apologetic for Christianity. He argues that if you read the Quran, so he points Muslims back to their own source. If you read the Quran, it refers to the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel as authoritative revelations from God. The claim that the texts have been corrupted is something that is added to the Islamic tradition after the actual Quran. And then his argument is, we actually have the texts that predate when Muhammad was around and the Quran was written. So these are the scriptures that Muhammad's talking about and referring to as authoritative. So Muslims, he argues, are bound to the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospels themselves. Second major objection to Christianity that Muslims historically, and in Theodore Abukura's context, would have used is that, yeah, you might claim that Jesus died and rose from the dead, but the Quran says in chapter 4, verse 157 and 158, that the Jews may boast that they killed the Messiah, Jesus, but they did not kill him, nor did he die. I think Dr. Heck mentioned this earlier this morning, that in the Islamic view of things, there was a person who took Jesus' place on the cross. Usually they'll refer to Judas. Some Muslim traditions say Simon the Cyrene was crucified. Can you imagine that poor guy? Just kind of hanging out there in Jerusalem and gets mixed up and gets crucified because people thought he was Jesus. But anyway, so Theodore Abukura emphasizes the historicity of those events. But the one that's most curious with Theodore Abukura kind of models what Paul does at Mars Hill, and also the feature of Justin Martyr's apologetic, is that Theodore Abukura goes to the Quran. He says, even your own source refers to Jesus as the Kalimatullah, the word of Allah, the word of God. And if it does that, you're bound to believe that Jesus was the word of God. And by the way, your Quran also refers to a Ruh Allah, a spirit of God. And so much later on, I don't want to put the cart too far behind or in front of the cart behind the horse. I didn't have any wine for lunch, but you know what I'm saying. Luther is going to make a similar point in a work he writes called The Refutation of the Quran, and go even a little further and say, whoever composed the Quran, the Holy Spirit caused them to mess up and add subtle Christian doctrines that Christians could use as points of conversation with Muslims. But that, it seems, begins with Theodore Abakura, where there's an emphasis that because Muslims typically believe the Old and New Testament to be corrupt, you can't argue from them. You've got to argue for the reliability of them, but even better than that is use their own literature, like Paul uses pagan literature to make a case for Christianity at Mars Hill. So he advocates using the Quran itself. I don't know that that's the best tact. I've spent a good 20 years mixing it up with Muslims, and they have some pretty ready responses to it. But it's still an interesting development, and it shows an openness to using what you can in a particular context to point to not just the gospel as a source of comfort, but the gospel is first and foremost true. More could be said. In the bibliography is a reference to a book just called Theodore Abakura. His writings were discovered not so long ago and have actually, interestingly, finally been translated into English. They're a fascinating read. More work needs to be done on that guy. Maybe if there's a future PhD candidate in here, you can pick up some Arabic and do that work so that I don't have to do it, because I can't remember Arabic so much anymore. But that kind of brings us to the close of the early apologists. And you can see they address all the challenges of the ancient world. And there's a whole slew, dozens and dozens of others that we could point at before the time of Theodore Abakura, who are in different contexts and in different ways, defending the gospel and making a case for the truthfulness of the gospel. Then we enter this period of church history called the Middle Ages or medieval Christendom, and it's a 1,000-year-long period. It's called Christendom because at least in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, I could have just said Europe there. In Europe, you have a civilization that emerges as pretty much thoroughly, with some rare exceptions, some pockets of Jews, for example, in the Rhineland Valley and so on. Most of the population in Europe becomes Christianized over the next couple generations. And you could, as it was put by one medievalist, you could, at least metaphorically speaking, if you were to travel from, say, the southern tips of Spain all the way to the northeast corners of Europe, like in what we'd call Poland today, in the height of medieval Christendom, everybody you encountered and every church you visited would have been very similar in terms of what it believed and how it practiced its faith. There would be some local variations, but by and large, there's a great, I don't think one can overemphasize, or one could easily overemphasize this, but it's fairly uniform. So there's not a whole lot of apologetic challenges within Europe. Even so, though, in the Middle Ages, you have a whole slew of authors who are thinking about Christianity apologetically. The two famous ones, though there's lots more, would be St. Anselm in the late 11th, early 12th century, and then after him, St. Thomas Aquinas of the 13th century, who, though nobody's asking the question, does God exist? Or what's the relationship between faith and reason and so on, they do address it because they're anticipating, Thomas Aquinas in particular, in a work called the Summation Against the Non-Christians, Summa Contra Gentiles, anticipates like all the objections one might encounter if you ventured out into, for example, the Muslim world or somewhere else, and basically writes a textbook. The Summation Against the Gentiles is a textbook for eventual missionaries to non-Christian lands, and develops a whole slew of arguments for God's existence, for the reliability of the truthfulness of the gospel, and so on. On top of that, you have also some medieval apologists, like St. Anselm, for example, in his work, in addition to writing the ontological argument for God's existence, he writes a book called Cur Deus Homo, Why the God-Man, which is usually taken to be a kind of like a systematic theological text on the doctrine of the incarnation and the atonement. And that, indeed, it very much is that. But if you read Why the God-Man closely, in particular the introduction, Anselm tells you why he wrote the book. It wasn't just some abstract theological exercise, but he's writing, he refers to the folks that live south of the Pyrenees Mountains, that is in Spain. Medieval Spain, all the way up until the 15th century, in fact, was dominated by Muslims ever since 711 AD when they crossed the Straits of Gibraltar. And so when Anselm writes Why the God-Man, he has in mind putting together an argument, making a case for the incarnation of God in Christ and the substitutionary atonement in the crucifixion, so that Christians who read that argument or that book, if they venture and are amidst Muslims or also by extension Jewish populations, they'd be able to give a case for Christianity to those populations. So while it's a pretty serious theological work, it has practical application, or at least Anselm and kind of thought about it, that it might serve that particular purpose. And of course, there's many more we could talk to. I want to talk about one more thing before we get into the Lutheran question, or the question of the relationship between Lutherans and apologetics in terms of the legacy of apologetics in Lutheran circles. And that is like sort of the last of the great apologetic works from the classical Christian era. One written, I believe, Craig mentioned him last night. His name was Hugo Grotius. He was Dutch. We won't hold that against him. He's about 100 years after Luther. In fact, he was born 1583, died in 1645, was a famous lawyer, oftentimes called the father of international law, wrote a famous work on addressing the legal question of who owns the seas, like whose property are the seas, and also is sometimes called the father of modern apologetics. He's in the Netherlands at a time where Catholics and Protestants, in particular Calvinists and Catholics, are all like contending for the future of the religious character of the Netherlands. He gets in on the side of Arminianism and advocates for Arminianism. We're not going to hold that against him for now. But this is like the 16 teens, and eventually is, because he's got this reputation for being a brilliant legal mind, isn't executed like a lot of the other Arminians, but is in fact put under house arrest. And there's this famous story of how while he's under house arrest, he was allowed to have books brought into him so he could do his writing and his research. And his wife apparently figured out like exactly how much he weighed, and she sent in a chest full of books with a little extra weight so that he could take out his weight in books and slide in underneath the books and be snuck out of this house arrest. And eventually he flees to Paris. He'll wind up in Hamburg, Germany. But right in the aftermath of his escape, he writes a little book that he'd thought about during the course of his imprisonment in Dutch called On the Truth of the Christian Religion. It's I don't know Dutch, but it's enough like German where you can kind of fumble your way through it. But the curious thing about On the Truth of the Christian Religion from 1622, it was not only written in Dutch, but written in rhymed verse. So it's written for a general Christian audience in a way that you could memorize it. And eventually, after the Dutch version, he'll add to it and make it in Latin. Then it'll be translated into Persian, Arabic, Chinese, every conceivable language that people who are from the Netherlands, sailors, might encounter. And if you look at the content of On the Truth of the Christian Religion, there's 6 chapters or books to it. It reads kind of like an apologetic textbook. It starts off with a chapter on, basically like classic arguments for God's existence, but written in a common way. It's not like William Lane Craig and questions about multiverse theory and all that seriously detailed stuff. That's 21st century stuff anyway, but it's written for the common Christian, gives you arguments for God's existence, has a chapter dedicated to the reliability, in particular, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, anticipating, he knows full well that Muslims believe it, those things are corrupted. He knows other people aren't just going to accept willy-nilly Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the Word of God, so it gives good positive arguments for believing, like Montgomery argued in his first point of his apologetic, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not just good, but the best primary source eyewitness material that we have on the life and teachings of Jesus. He's got a section on the historicity of the claims in the gospel and the Bible in general. And then he's got 3 chapters dedicated to 3 particular religions that might challenge Christianity. One on Islam, one on Judaism, and one on what he calls pagans. What he has in mind there are like Buddhists and Hindus, and he just didn't have the terminology for it yet. But what's, for my money, I don't have a whole lot, we were talking about this at lunch, but in fact I've toyed quitting everything and moving to Alaska to look for gold. But when he wrote it in Dutch at first, and even after that, he always had in mind as he wrote that Europe is basically Christian. The people who are encountering non-Christians are sailors. So he wrote it very intentionally with an audience of sailors in mind. So I don't know if you know anything about sailors. I'm a Navy veteran, so I can poke fun at them a little bit. Sailors aren't like the ideal candidates for being missionaries. When they go to foreign ports, they're not always looking for people to evangelize. But Hugo Grote says the people who have the best chance of having contact with people who have never heard or don't know the gospel, it's going to be them. So he always had in mind writing and providing the details and arguments for people who might encounter actual, real non-Christians. And for that reason, he's oftentimes referred to as the father of modern Christian apologetics. I haven't even looked at my watch. Okay, I've got a whopping 18 minutes to do the rest. So there's a tremendous legacy of apologetics from the 1st century all the way up into the 7th century, the close of the great Christian era and right before the Enlightenment settles in, which gives birth to a whole bunch of new apologetic endeavors. One question for especially a Lutheran audience, assuming most are Lutherans here, if not all, we won't ask you to pull out your membership card, which synod you're affiliated with, but the question I get among Lutherans, though, is, or the accusation oftentimes is, yeah, but that's other Christians. Lutherans really don't do apologetics. And Mr. Parton last night talked at length about how not only was Montgomery an outstanding apologist, but he was a thoroughgoing confessional Lutheran at the same time. Montgomery's not an innovator there. Like, he's not the first guy among confessional Lutheranism to say, hey, we ought to take 1 Peter 3:15 seriously. Lutherans themselves have always been involved in apologetic work, going back to the very, if you will, founder. I mean, Adam was the first Lutheran, but we all know that, but Luther, at least for the time being, we'll say is the founder of Lutheranism. That's kind of a dumb joke. But Martin Luther, to be sure, wrote in the Small Catechism, and we all hopefully confess, I'm sure we all confess, that we cannot come by using our own reason or strength, come to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, but the Holy Spirit gives us the gift of faith. He also wrote, though, in that same catechism, as he explains the first article to the Creed, that God has given us our reason and our sense experience and still preserves them, even though we're fallen. So there's, in terms of reason in the life of a Christian from a Lutheran perspective, Luther believed that reason was God's greatest gift to human beings. In fact, it's one of the great things that separates human beings from animals. He also wrote apologetic works himself. You probably are at least somewhat familiar that he wrote on Jews or Jewish theology. Not all of it is nasty like the later stuff he wrote, which is kind of nasty. In 1523, very early on in the Reformation, this is like just 2 years after he takes his stand at the Diet of Worms, he writes a little book called That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew. That doesn't mirror, and I don't know if anybody's looked at this in detail and proven it, but basically reads like a 16th century version of Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho the Jew. It's a very forceful, robust argument that gets into the weeds in some places over the character of those messianic prophecies, and that there is nobody who fulfilled it but Jesus Christ. The work was so powerful that if you're, this is like I'll admit I'm a super nerd here. There might be a few other super nerds here. If you go to Jack Preuss's translation of Martin Chemnitz's Loci Theologici, there's a footnote in there. I used to know the page number. There's a footnote in there that corresponds to a name in Chemnitz's work, Bernard Giffer, that says that Bernard Giffer showed up at the University of Wittenberg in the late 1520s. He was formerly a rabbi who had read Luther's that Jesus Christ was born a Jew and become a Christian as a result of that, and went into Christian ministry, was a pastor or a theologian thereafter. So had some effect. That Jesus Christ was born a Jew was even translated into Hebrew for the use of missionaries to be used in the Holy Land. So kind of interesting, and that's not just a one-off of Luther's. He wrote some other things for the evangelization and the defense of the gospel among Jewish populations. For as far as we know, Luther never really had any serious face-to-face meetings with Jews or rabbis, but there is some evidence that there was some letters written back and forth. We just don't have that work anymore. In addition to that, in the 16th century, there's the challenge of Islam that had been a long challenge to Christianity resurfaces again, such that Luther himself in Wittenberg has to deal with it. Some of you might know that while the Protestant Reformation is awesome, there's a whole lot more going on than just these ecclesiastical theological debates in the 16th century. In fact, had it not been for a few events in Luther's day and age, the Protestant Reformation may not have taken off. Because had the Ottoman Turks from now called Istanbul not been marching up the Danube River basin with their eyes on Vienna through the course of the first 2-3 decades of the Reformation, and had the emperor not needed Saxon mercenaries and other armies from North Germany, and therefore had not been forced to make concessions over time in various diets and so on and councils, chances are Luther would have endured the same fate as a person like John Huss about a century earlier. The threat of Islam was so profound, though it's not told in the older histories of the Reformation in the 16th century, that Luther could say in one work in 1530, says, "The Turk and his religion are at our very doorstep. There's a great danger that our people, my dear Germans," as he put it, might end up behind enemy lines and feel coerced to embrace the religion of the Mohammedans. So Luther puts pen to paper and begins to write a whole bunch of works addressing the issue of the Turks, everything from a denouncing crusades, which the popes were calling for at the time. Leo X, in fact, had called for a crusade. Luther says that's inappropriate, but as a matter of self-defense, every man, woman, and child is obligated to defend their home and their town against any sort of Turkish or Muslim raids. Then he critiques a little bit of Islam as he gets information on it, and says around 1529 that he's going to withhold writing extensively on Islam, which he never called Islam because nobody knew that was what it was called. He called it Mohammedanism. I'm going to wait till I get my hands on the Quran, and then I'm going to write something on this. And 1542, Shrove Tuesday of 1542, he writes a letter to a friend, I think it was to Philip Melanchthon, that says, somebody just sent me a copy of a Latin translation of the Quran, and says, I'm going to write a refutation of it, but I also want to encourage, and you should too, Melanchthon, that it be published in the city of Basel. And 1542, 1543, a bunch of things happen in the history of Christian-Muslim relations when it comes to literature that Luther's almost single-handedly responsible for. First, a Latin translation of the Quran, along with a bunch of Latin translations of what are called hadiths. These are other things that Muslims use to draw their theological and legal conclusions from. Histories of the life of Muhammad, the Ottoman Turks, and Islam generally, and then a collection of medieval Christian apologetics vis-a-vis Islam appear with a preface at the very beginning written by none other than Martin Luther. You dig into that history, it's quite fascinating because you learn that that would not have been published had Luther not written a letter to the Council of Basel, because they had actually thrown the publisher in jail for daring to print the Quran. And Luther writes a letter to him and says, you need to let that guy go so he can produce this, because we need to know about Islam, because the Ottoman Turks are going to take Vienna one day, and the whole world, as he put it in his preface to the book of Daniel, is going to go Mohammedan. So the council reverses its decision. The Quran is released. It becomes a bestseller in the year 1543. 6 editions of this book that's about this big is put out, and they're all prefaced by Luther's preface. Then the great work comes out the following year, a work that Luther entitled The Refutation of the Quran. It's a 17-chapter long negative and positive apologetic that Luther, as he gave instructions to his publisher, hoped would end up in the pockets of soldiers going off to fight against the Turk. He says, after he sends the manuscript to the publisher, he says, because they're the ones who are most at risk at living under Muslim rule and being coerced into the religion of Muhammad, they need to be able to address the challenges that Muslims pose to them. Long story short, the 14 chapters of the Refutation of the Quran are dedicated to like a very close analysis of the issues and errors of the Quran. And they're not just arguments like, oh, the Quran teaches this, it doesn't square up with Christian teachings, therefore it's wrong. It's more of an inspection of the Quran that says, oh, look, the Quran in one place says, Luther didn't put it that way, oh, look, but in one place, the Quran says that Mary, who's the only woman mentioned in the Quran, the Virgin Mary, is the brother of Moses. And Luther says, that's dumb. He probably had more robust things to say about it than that, but that's like 1,500 years at least. Oh, look, the Quran says that Jesus wasn't crucified. That's dumb. That's not historically tenable. Then he'll point out that there's lots of contradictions within the Quran, where in some passages the Quran says that Muslims and Christians are the nearest in affection to each other. When you come across Christians, treat them well. And then in other places in the Quran it says when you come across people of the book, like Jews and Christians and maybe Zoroastrians, kill them unless they convert to Islam. And so Luther says, so even within the Quran there's all sorts of internal contradictions. Then the Quran is violent. It encourages all sorts of immorality like temporary marriage, the dispensing of wives just by announcing you divorced that woman 3 times in a row, and so on and so forth. But it's about 14 chapters of a thoroughgoing criticism of Islamic beliefs and the Quran. Then it gets to this real interesting part in the last 3 chapters where Luther says, now that I've dismantled or deconstructed, we might say, use that term today, the Quran, now I want to encourage my readers in how they might make a case for the gospel among Mohammedans. And he says, Muslims, while the Quran encourages them to respect the Torah, the Psalms, and the gospel, they don't take it as authoritative. So you have to use something else. And he says, use the Quran itself. And what's interesting with Luther's refutation of the Quran is you look at it closely, much of it is basically a German translation from an old medieval apologetic written by a missionary who was in Baghdad for a while. But Luther adds in his own stuff. And Luther says, you use the Quran because that's what's going to gain traction in a Muslim context. And this is where I think I mentioned it earlier before lunch, where Luther even adds into the text, he says, and in fact, the Holy Spirit has caused some stuff to be put into the Quran so that you might use it to teach Christian doctrine to Muslims. In particular, he says, to be sure, Muhammad and Muslims are not Trinitarian, but there's enough information in the Quran that opens up the possibility that God might not be this Unitarian type of God, but rather God has a word and also a spirit. And Luther encourages his readers that this could be used to make a case for the rationality or the truthfulness of the doctrine of the Trinity. And he says, and then he's got a section, he goes, the Quran denies the basic or the most central article of the Christian faith, that is, Jesus was crucified for our sins and rose from the dead for our justification. The Quran denies that. But the Quran only does that because the Holy Spirit caused it to deny basic historic facts so that you could mock Islam for contradicting blatantly what well-known established history concerning Jesus and so on. There's other arguments along those lines. Luther comes to the conclusion, though, in the work and says that you'll find that among the Muslims are the hardest people to convert. They're stubborn and so on. He goes, but that does not mean that you are absolved of being a lion heart for the defense of the gospel. In fact, the scriptures exhort every Christian to be able to do this regardless of circumstances. And then he also writes one more work that's called usually translated, it has been translated, it's not been published yet. In the past, the title has been given The Army Sermon Against the Turk. When it is published, it will come under the title Muster Sermon Against the Turk, where Luther does a whole lot of eschatological speculation concerning the Turks, but the second half gives actual, real practical advice for Christians living under Muslim lands or in Muslim lands. He says, if you find yourself captive to the Turk, consider that what God now has for you, but also consider that you will not have access to Christian literature. If you have a Bible and it's discovered, it will probably be discarded. You won't even have a pastor or anybody to speak the gospel to you. So you need to now, while you still have time and opportunity, to learn the Christian faith for yourself. And he's got a section where he basically encourages all his readers to begin memorizing the small catechism. And then he says, now that you're equipped with the core knowledge of the Christian faith, you need to think about what life will look like for you under Islam. You probably won't be required to embrace Islam, he argues. But you will most likely be a slave or a servant of the Turk. So, if you find yourself in that position, you need to treat your Turkish master like he's your neighbor, serve him well. And in fact, if you serve him dutifully, you might get the opportunity because he might ask you what makes you so different than his other servants and slaves. And when your master does ask you what makes you different or what motivates your love for your master, then you might get the opportunity to speak the gospel to them. And if they object to it along Muslim lines, you know how to respond. In particular, he says, respond with the second article of the creed. This is the core of Christianity, the center and circumference of Christianity. Learn that and learn the defense of that in case you end up behind enemy lines. So if there's a example of apologetics in action, not just ivory tower stuff like Thomas Aquinas writing in a monastery about the 5 ways of proving God's existence, but an actual encouragement to defend the gospel and an equipping of how to defend the gospel in a particular context, that's Luther. So you got Luther already. You've got lots of other characters. I think Mr. Parton mentioned last night that Dr. Montgomery gave these lectures here in the 70s, I think it was, where he's got a listing of all the great Lutheran systematic theologians from the 17th century and how they employed the apologetic reasoning of Hugo Grotius and other apologists in their prolegomena, basically the introduction to their works. So you got from Luther through the age of orthodoxy within Lutheranism, and not just an openness, but an embracing of evidential, positive apologetics. Then you come to the 19th century, and this is the last guy I'm going to talk about. One more great Lutheran apologist I want to mention because he's not well known in any Lutheran circles. His name was Otto Zockler. He was part of what's oftentimes called the neo-confessional Lutheran revival in Germany in the 19th century. He was not like a physical student, but followed the writings of a man who wrote the book, The Christology of the Old Testament, Ernst Hengstenberg, if that might be a reference some of you might be aware of. But Otto Zockler wrote Ernst Hengstenberg after he finished his undergraduate work and said to him, I'm thinking about, after my seminary training, doing a PhD. What do you recommend I go into? And Hengstenberg gives a fantastic response. He says, there's a lot of us who have done tremendous work in exegetical theology, systematic theology, and heavens knows we have more than enough specialists in the liturgy. He goes, what we don't have is somebody who works in the arena of natural theology and positive apologetics. He says, in Germany right now, materialism has basically dominated the natural science departments, and it's starting to influence the other softer sciences. And if it continues to trickle down into German society, who knows what will happen? It will, how did Hengstenberg put it? He says, it will leave no basis for even basic morality among the German people. We need somebody now who's able to not only make a case for God's existence, but be able to demonstrate the truthfulness in a positive way, a positive theological case or historical case for the Christian faith, and then encourages him to do his graduate work and something that would help with that. So Zockler goes to university, does a PhD in natural sciences. And then in just after 1856, when Darwin published his Origin of Species, Zockler got a hold of it right away, read it several times through, and then dared to write a letter to Charles Darwin. So you got a confessional Lutheran who starts an epistolary exchange between himself and Charles Darwin. And then when Darwin publishes I always forget whether it's Ascent or Descent of Man. It must be Ascent of Man, right? No Darwin fans here? Anyway, in 1873, Darwin makes his case for how, the evolution of human beings. How it is, we go from amoebas to man or something like that. And Zockler realizes that there is nothing stopping not only this materialist worldview, but the assertion of Darwin's theory of natural selection in the universities. And he says, and if that ever takes hold and informs the social sciences, politics, and ethics, we might see a tremendous amount of evil break out. That's like 1870s when he writes that. So he dedicates the last 20, 30 years of his life to writing. None of them are available in English, sadly, but if you can see images of them on Google Books and things, like these massive multi-volume accounts with Frakturscript German on the history between theology and science, all for the sake of demonstrating that, one, there is no contradiction between doing scientific work and being a good Christian theologian. Two, to show that Darwin and materialism were not just like recent innovations, but when subjected to philosophical analysis, not only had tremendous like social and political and ethical ramifications, but simply rendered human beings kind of null and void. Because if human beings, like C.S. Lewis would argue, if our brain is simply just a composition of atoms and chemicals and so on and so forth, why would you even trust your brain? You wouldn't even be able to trust your brain enough to think that the results of your scientific research are legitimate in any sense of the term. So then one of the late great works of Otto Zockler, after he's done mixing it up with Darwin and others for some time, as a confessional Lutheran, I mentioned that before, is he writes this massive Geschichte der Apologia, or I think it's der Apologia, a history of Christian apologetics. That too has not been translated in English. But in there, he's got this section on Martin Luther, where he argues that if there is and of course he's partisan, but if there is a person whose theology matches best an apologetic for our day and age, he's writing in the early 20th century at this point, it would be Luther's theology, because it keeps Christ at the center and keeps us from getting distracted into all these nooks and crannies of apologetics, and lays the basic epistemological foundation for knowing and believing that not only do we have just a hazy natural revelation of God in creation, but we have a real verifiable special revelation of God in the person and work of Christ, and by extension, based on the words of Jesus, the very word of God in the Old and the New Testament. There's more we could talk about with regard to Lutheran apologists. My only point in bringing this out is that apologetics is not something new with Montgomery and the Lutheran tradition, and that you can also, maybe more importantly, if you're a Lutheran, do apologetics and do it with a good conscience. I don't know if anybody needed to be persuaded of that. If you still do, we can go outside and just wrestle over it, I guess. Last thing I want to touch on is ask the question, now that we've kind of done a very general overview of apologetics through the ages, is ask the question what we can learn from all this apologetic activity. First and foremost, this was mentioned especially with respect to C.S. Lewis this morning, is one of the great legacies of apologetics that you can witness as you read the story of Christian apologetics is just how, even though you might have like a super neo-confessional Lutheran theologian or an Orthodox theologian like Theodore Abukura, the apologist is always nimble and aware of their context. And always, as much as you might want to quote the Formula of Concord before Richard Dawkins, the apologist realizes that may not gain any traction. Quoting the Bible, as much as we want to quote the Bible to a secular arena on matters of, a case for life, pro-life position, or the historicity of the resurrection, that really isn't going to gain traction in an audience that doesn't accept the Bible as an authority in the first place. So apologists are always attentive to context, but also nimble in those contexts, in recognizing that context doesn't set the content, but it does establish the starting point. And the only way you're going to be aware of those things is if you just simply ask questions or do a little research on that particular context. Secondly, throughout the course of Christian apologetics, contrary to the claims of Jamie Smith in Who's Afraid of Postmodernism and others like him, the history of Christian apologetics is mostly engaged in both negative and positive apologetics, and only very recently engaged in what are called presuppositional apologetics. That's Jamie Smith's book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, advocates for a presuppositionalism, which he thinks is this historical thing. Jamie Smith's a brilliant philosopher and theologian in the Reformed tradition, but he is definitely no historian. One thing that is painfully obvious in the history of apologetics is that always a ready use of facts and evidence in particular apologetic arguments, and a willingness to critique the non-Christian position, but not just leave it hanging, but also be willing to make a case for the truthfulness of it all. And lastly, I'm way past time. If I do have a URL, oh, maybe I don't. If you go online and you type in Apologetics for the 21st Century and the name John Warwick Montgomery, there's a delightful little essay in his old, I guess it's his personal web page on Apologetics in the 21st Century, where he argues that now that we're headlong into this, what some call post-Christian era, the vestiges of our Christian past remaining, the day and age for apologetics there's always an occasion for it, but the day and age for it is today. So he encourages his reader to take every opportunity to make apologetic cases for the truthfulness of Christianity, but always keep the main thing, and in particular, if you, as Mr. Parton mentioned last night, and Dr. Heck mentioned this morning with C.S. Lewis, the main thing is not all the peripheral things like the age of the earth and so on, as important as those things are. The main thing is, who is Jesus? And especially the Lutheran Apologists is very well equipped to handle that in keeping with their theological tradition. So I commend that essay to you if you want to think about how you might go about thinking about apologetics in our particular arena. What you'll find, though, is Montgomery encourages everybody, not just pastors, but laity, to use their vocations, their strengths, and all the tools that are available to us through the invention of this magical thing called the intrawebs and so on, to always be prepared to give a reason for the hope within us. Thank you.
Thank you again. Very well done. Excellent. We'll take time for one question. If somebody has a question, and then we'll take a break and come back for the questions for all of the panelists. So, is there one question that we would like to address to Dr.?
There's one in the middle back there.
Go ahead.
I can't really. Oh, I think that's your son, isn't it?
Yeah, it is my son.
I thought of one that would be fun. So, question that I'll break down into three parts. So, if you could choose an apologist from all the history, all the time periods they went over, not Montgomery or Lewis, since that's kind of. If you could pick one that would be extremely relevant to today, who you wish could be speaking to American culture today as a Christian apologist from all of antiquity, who would you pick? Why? And then, what selection of any of his writings would you recommend for us to read?
Ooh. Is Paul an option? No? Yeah, I'm guessing Jesus isn't an option. That's the one time in church where a Lutheran church, Jesus isn't an option. Yeah, well, I'm going to just shoot from the hip, and I know I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying it because it's not a Lutheran. I'm going to say Hugo Grotius. But I will say, there are stories, I don't know that they're true, I don't think they're true, that he did become a Lutheran on his deathbed. Of course, we Lutherans love to believe those things are true, I don't know. But why Hugo Grotius? Because I think he's a lawyer, he's a legal theorist or scholar, I don't know how to describe that, but so he's wired to think always inductively and think very broadly, and always thinking about, others do this as well, but always think about there's the different contexts and anticipating what the objections in that particular context might be. So that's if I have to choose somebody from way back in what the kids call old-timey history now, but there's lots of others, but is that okay?
There was a selected writing that you'd recommend for us to
On
read.
the Truth of the Christian Religion, the one published by Liberty Fund, I think it's just called Liberty Fund out of Indianapolis. They have a new English translation of it in modern English instead of the King's English. No offense if you like the King's English, and it's got tons of footnotes. It's a critical edition. It's really good. So for a historical apologetic, yeah. Or Athanasius. I would choose Athanasius, but we're probably out of time for that.
I'll be sure to check that out. Thank you.
Okay.